glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
That's a good one.
The motion is tabled. The time has arrived for oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 3:33. We will end at 5:03. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, the government has a habit of over-promising and under-delivering when it comes to job targets, Mr. Speaker. And I sincerely hope we're able to bring 440 Nova Scotians home. Too many of our sons and daughters have fled the province because of the government's economic mismanagement, Mr. Speaker. 4,000 young Nova Scotians have left our province since the NDP have taken office. So my question to the Minister is, why has the government created an economy that is forcing young Nova Scotians out of our province at an accelerated rate?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise my place in response is that what we are doing, and we've declared when we came into government, we were going to do things differently. We were going to create employment and stop the out-migration of Nova Scotians. We've done that. We will continue to do that. 7,600 new jobs since we've been government, as opposed to 20 years of a last-place finish.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, young people are needing help from this government. Even though they've needed it for 3 years, government has sat idly by while they've left our province. Those that remain are struggling to find work, Mr. Speaker. Youth, the face of the unemployment rate in their province is almost at 19%, which is an increase, Mr. Speaker, since the NDP government has taken office in 2009. So my question for the minister, why has this government pursued economic policies that have either forced young Nova Scotians to leave our province or to the unemployment line?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, we are creating high-paying jobs so our young people do not have to go to Alberta.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, they must be creating those jobs elsewhere because young Nova Scotians are leaving, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government likes to hype the government's job announcements. We need to look no further, Mr. Speaker, than the example of DSME Trenton. Remember when the Premier promised 500 jobs, Mr. Speaker, and there are less than 60 people working there today. And Nova Scotians look at this Premier with his job targets with suspicion, Mr. Speaker. He agrees to give $590 million to 6 companies and watch them lay off 1,300 Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So my question, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister. You want me to start over again, Mr. Speaker?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister, with so many botched business deals and missed job targets, why should Nova Scotians trust you now?
Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think with what this government has done, when I look at Shelburne Shipyard, when I consider the game changers that are on the horizon for the future of Nova Scotia, the Irving Shipbuilding contract, Mr. Speaker, 11,500 jobs, Mr. Speaker, not to mention Muskrat Falls, Mr. Speaker. We've worked towards the future, Mr. Speaker. Now, I can understand, Mr. Speaker, how some past governments didn't understand that philosophy. If we had 20 years, just think what we could have done, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today the Premier announced he's giving $11.4 million in taxpayers' money to Projects Technologies, an engineering firm that set up in Nova Scotia last year. Well, Mr. Speaker, there are many engineering firms already established in Nova Scotia, including 6 that have moved here in recent years, all without financial assistance from the NDP. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, why Projects and not these other companies? Was it simply because they asked?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not giving anything to anyone. In fact, Projects is a company, as he pointed out, an engineering company out of Alberta. They will come to Nova Scotia or expand in Nova Scotia, to be more appropriate. 440 jobs, the average paycheck around $90,000 per a job. That's going to at the end of the 5 years, those 440 jobs will represent almost $50 million a year into the economy of Nova Scotia. That's 440 families with good jobs paying money into our economy. And they're new jobs and new work. It's an export business, taking work from other places and doing it here.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier says there are new jobs, and we all wish that that was true. Projects is on a hiring spree right now, Mr. Speaker. 20 people they've hired from Stantec, an existing Nova Scotia engineering firm. Another 8 they've hired from SNC Lavalin, another existing Nova Scotia engineering firm. They've hired engineers from AMEC, Whitman Bend, another existing Nova Scotia engineering firm, all with taxpayer incentives to move jobs from one end of Halifax to the other end of Halifax, Mr. Speaker. That is not job creation. It's simply using taxpayers' money to move existing jobs around. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Economic Development said he doesn't see how government investment in DSTN gives them an advantage over other companies. Obviously it does. We'd hope the Premier would see the difference. Obviously he doesn't either. So my question to the Premier is quite simple. Why is he using taxpayers' money to simply move existing jobs around?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, this is work that this company has that is done in Alberta for Alberta companies. Now, they can either hire people from Nova Scotia to go to work in Calgary and do the work, or they can hire people in Halifax to do the work. The work for the other company remains with them. They can hire their own employees, and in fact, what this does, Mr. Speaker, is it widens the supply of engineers in the province by keeping new graduates here, by attracting back engineers from other parts of the country into Halifax. It increases the supply for the engineering community, creates 440 well-paying jobs, puts $18 million into the tax pockets of the province to be able to spend on health, education, new roads. Wish it was stuff that the Leader of the Conservative Party understood.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I really wish the Premier would understand that paying one company to move a job from one end of the city of Halifax to the other end of the city of Halifax is not actually creating a new job. Common sense tells us that. Our own local engineering firms are telling them that. What the Premier says is true of this one company that he is chosen to sprinkle taxpayers' money on is true of all engineering firms in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the difference now is those other firms are having their own tax dollars used against them to compete for engineers in Nova Scotia. That's what's wrong with the NDP approach. I really wish that what the Premier was saying about jobs coming from Alberta to here was exclusively true, but it's not. So I will ask the Premier, if that's the case, can he get up in the House right now and assure all of us and all Nova Scotians that no taxpayer money will pay one company to recruit from another?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all the companies in Nova Scotia in a sector compete on a broad basis. They advertise and people answer those advertisements. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, in the case of Projects, more than 700 people from outside of the province of Nova Scotia have already applied for jobs to come back to Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. This particular arrangement also requires the company to hire new grads. to hire engineering graduates from the schools of engineering in the region so that young people can actually stay in the province and get good jobs here. That, Mr. Speaker, is the difference between this government and the ex-government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Economic Development said, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, DSTN, as I said, are diversifying. They've been working on a market strategy. They're looking for markets all over the world, end of quote. And he was certainly correct. An internal company communications indicates that DSME is preparing to open an engineering company in Houston, Texas. So my question to the Minister, when did the government become aware that the government business partner, DSME, was creating jobs in Houston, Texas, and not in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know where it's considered as a prerequisite that a parent company of a company that's based here in Nova Scotia has to tell the province of Nova Scotia how they're expanding their business, Mr. Speaker. I don't know why they feel they would have to tell us.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Surprised, Mr. Speaker, at the way these guys have been writing checks that every company wouldn't be telling them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, DSME is preparing to open an engineering firm in Houston, Texas. In the last year, the number of unemployed in North Shore has increased by more than 17%. And the unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker, is continuing to go up. Mr. Speaker, this government promised 500 jobs, Mr. Speaker, but according to this government's number, only a fraction of those jobs have been created. So my question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, with so many unemployed people in Pictou County, will the Minister guarantee that none of the $60 million that he's invested will be spent to create those jobs in Houston, Texas?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answer to that is an obvious one, simply no.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, is the Minister not guaranteeing that, Mr. Speaker? We all remember Resolute, Mr. Speaker, the $25 million we handed over to Bowater, which they quickly took to Quebec to invest in Quebec, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we all remember the $25 million that they gave to Resolute that they took out of the province and invested in Quebec, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are more unemployed Nova Scotians than in December of 2008, in the middle of the recession, Mr. Speaker. We've lost 3,400 full-time jobs since this government has taken office. This government has watched 6 companies that agreed to give $590 million to lay off more than 1,300 Nova Scotians. Now this government-owned company is getting ready to create jobs in Texas. Who knew jobs here was referring, Mr. Speaker, to Texas, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, given the announcement that we talked about here today, did the government attempt to convince DSME to create those engineering jobs here instead of Houston, Texas, to fulfill its $60 million obligation it has with the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition certainly, in my opinion, doesn't understand the global economy when it comes to employment and the jobs and the way employers work around the world. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition his numbers are misleading. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, is that we created, since we took over government, we have created 7,600 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Economic Development said, and I quote, "I can speak on behalf of this Premier and this party. We want DSTN to be successful. We want them to create good jobs for the good people of Pictou County. That's why we have recommended to them to diversify, look at a larger market, Mr. Speaker, and be competitive," end of quote. So my question to the Minister, since the government told DSME to diversify, Was it the Minister or the Premier who told them to enter into markets that put them in direct competition against other Nova Scotia companies?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, DST and Pictou, we took a facility that had been lying idle for a long time, a very long time. We took that facility, we turned that facility into a productive site with a partnership with a world famous, a world renowned, a world recognized partner, Mr. Speaker. We've done this with confidence. We still have confidence in DSTN. We know, Mr. Speaker, that if that party over there would get out of the way, we'd see more success in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Improving the infrastructure of this plant, Mr. Speaker, to create wind turbines that no one's buying, Mr. Speaker. That's a really good investment of taxpayers' money, Mr. Speaker. DSME plans to compete against Nova Scotia businesses, Mr. Speaker, which will require upgrades to the plant and equipment, Mr. Speaker. The company's diversification will also require additional training and specialized certification. The government told DSME to diversify, and DSME listened, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but this will cost money. So my question to the Minister, does the Minister plan to give DSME more money to fund the cost associated with the upgrades that will require for his diversification plan?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this question comes as no surprise to me because it was that leader, that party over there, Mr. Speaker, that spoke against 400 jobs in the South Shore, Mr. Speaker. It was that government, that party over there that spoke out against Irving Shipbuilding, Mr. Speaker. It was that party over there and that speaker that spoke out against Port Hawkesbury, against NewPage, Mr. Speaker. It was that party, that leader over there that spoke out against all those things about job creation in the province of Nova Scotia. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, about a 30 to a 50% hike in power rates, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, was that government and that minister that has increased power by 30%, Mr. Speaker? That's no fiction. That's reality in Nova Scotia that facing every day, Mr. Speaker. It was that minister and that government that promised 400 jobs to the people of the South Shore, Mr. Speaker, when Resolute cast the check and headed off to Quebec, Mr. Speaker. Not a single job, Mr. Speaker. It was that government, Mr. Speaker, that wrote a check to Scanwood, Mr. Speaker, just before they go bankrupt, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was that government that wrote $155 million to Stern, Mr. Speaker, at the same time they were sending pink slips out to half the workforce in the state area, Mr. Speaker. That's not economic development, Mr. Speaker. That's not an economic development strategy, Mr. Speaker. That's an open door for big business to walk in and pick the pockets of a sorry government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we now know, Mr. Speaker, we now know that this government encouraged DSME to enter into the oil and gas sector, Mr. Speaker, and shipbuilding business, Mr. Speaker, and they sat idly by while their business partner is creating jobs in Texas. So my question to the minister, as he was telling his business partner to diversify to compete against oil and gas companies in Nova Scotia, should there be any other sector in this province that should be concerned about your government's diversification plan?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you the facts. It was this government that invested in Stream in Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. It was this government that invested in Shelburne, Mr. Speaker, so that they could have a viable shipyard today, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. It was this government that invested in Eden Valley and Berwick, Mr. Speaker. It was this government that makes investments that will produce good jobs for good Nova Scotians in the province of Nova Scotia. And it's this government that will take care of the future, Mr. Government, unlike previous governments in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, 7,400 Nova Scotians have lost their full-time jobs since October of 2009. in every age category, full-time jobs are now disappearing in our province. In fact, we hear weekly of more layoffs, whether it's Minas Basin Pulp and Power or Bowater, and the list goes on and on. All the while, Mr. Speaker, the Premier and his government have given out $500 million to specific companies. So my question to the Premier, in light of this evidence, will he abandon his expensive corporate welfare spending spree and get on with the job of actually making our economy better?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I really hope that the leader of the Conservative Party doesn't think that anybody is taking him seriously, because the reality is that every jurisdiction in North America, in fact, almost every jurisdiction in the world, has a business retention and attraction mechanism of some kind, whether it is something like a rebate program, which of course relies on the actual creation of jobs and the actual expenditure of the payroll money in order to recover anything. It's essentially companies being paid with their own money. Now, Mr. Speaker, what the leader of the Conservative Party, and for that matter, the leader of the Liberal Party, never says, for example, with respect to Irving, which was in the area of $300 million, is that that is a commercial loan. A commercial loan to Irving at a commercial rate, Mr. Speaker, repayable to the province of Nova Scotia. Let me finish. Repayable to the province of Nova Scotia at a commercial rate with the proviso that if they create the jobs that are expected and pay to the province some $2.4 billion in tax revenue, they can earn the forgiveness of it. Mr. Speaker, even for the inexperienced leader of the opposition, surely he would see, as the leader of the Conservative Party would see, the good sense of that kind of an arrangement.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure all members in the House appreciated the Premier's description of the rest of the world. But here is what is unique about Nova Scotia. We have the highest taxes in the whole country under his government. We have skyrocketing power rates in this province under his government. We have a string of deficits and new debt on the backs of all Nova Scotians under his government. That is what is unique about Nova Scotia that gets in the way of building a modern, dynamic and growing economy. Mr. Speaker, Michelin, for example, is one of our largest employers. 3,500 jobs in rural Nova Scotia, good, high-paying jobs. It's now been 125 days. It's now been 125 days, Mr. Speaker, since they cancelled their expansion plans, leaving the people of the Annapolis Valley waiting and waiting for those good jobs. So my question to the Premier, why are the residents of the Annapolis Valley still waiting for those good jobs?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why Michelin has been successful and has been here in Nova Scotia is because, among other things, including capital grants, they took advantage of payroll rebates. That's what brought them to Nova Scotia. That is what has kept them here, and that is part of the business plan that they continue to pursue. Now, Mr. Speaker, on power rates, we have increases in power rates because the power generating stations in this province are based on coal, fossil fuels, based on decisions made by the previous government. The deficits that we have, as shown by the audit that was done and by the economic panel, is a result of the decisions on spending made by the former government. Yes, Mr. Speaker, their complaint is that we haven't cleaned up their mess fast enough.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, apparently, according to the Premier, Michelin had nothing to do with their own success, which I'm sure will be news to the workers and the people of Michelin, which is a worldwide success story. Investing in plants all over the world, except for the ones here during his term as Premier. And the question is why? Mr. Speaker, when Michelin does so well everywhere else, Nova Scotians, particularly those in the Annapolis Valley, are still waiting 125 days to find out why those jobs aren't coming here. Mr. Speaker, in fact, if the Premier wants to look around him, 688,000 full-time jobs have been added everywhere in Canada except Nova Scotia under his term in office, where we're down 7,400 full-time jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, here is a suggestion, a cost-free way to make Nova Scotia attractive again for Michelin, for all kinds of other companies. Will the Premier reconsider his first contract law now and send a signal, a cost-free signal, that this can be a good place to create jobs again?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple reality of the situation is, and Statistics Canada, even the most recent Statistics Canada show that there are 7,600 more jobs in Nova Scotia than there were when we came to power. From the peak of the recession to the peak employment pre-recession till now, we have more jobs in Nova Scotia, despite the fact that our economy, just like economies around the world, have been battered by some of the strongest economic recessionary pressures in the history of modern society, Mr. Speaker. We have managed through those. We have grown the economy. We've won the largest industrial contract in the history of the province. We're building our way into energy self-sufficiency, and we're bringing 440 new engineering jobs to the province, just announced today.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During an October 18, 2011 meeting of the Economic Development Committee, it was decided that a tour of the DSME facility would be arranged. This was enthusiastically agreed to by the government members who had the utmost confidence in DSTN investment at that time. We have yet to have the tour and repeatedly are told it's not possible due to scheduling conflicts. However, on December 16, 2011, DSME announced 40 layoffs. So my question to the Minister of Economic Development: did the Minister know about the pending committee tour, and did he express concern to the Chair regarding a visit to a facility destined for layoffs and diversification?
Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've toured DSTN prior to DSTN and certainly after, and it was just such a nice positive result to see the before and after, Mr. Speaker. I would never, nor have I ever, interfered with anything that with respect to a planned tour of any facility in the province of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on December 18, 2011, there were 40 layoffs announced at DSME Trenton. On May 25, 2012, another 26 people laid off. We have seen media reports saying 70 people are employed at the plant. In August, the Minister said approximately 66 people were now employed. Just last week, he said there were less than 60 at DSME Trenton. This Minister said he gets daily briefings from the company, and given his government's commitment to create 500 jobs, I would hope he routinely asked about the current levels of employment. So my question to the Minister, based on his DSME briefing today, will the Minister tell us how many people are working at the site today and when the plant is expected to hit a workforce of 500 people?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, DSTN is an active plant. They're looking at more global markets. They're expanding their market strategy. They're reaching out to other markets, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, we are patient here. We along with the federal government, when we first were approached and we approached DSTN, unlike other governments, Mr. Speaker, we didn't sit back and wait for things not to happen, Mr. Speaker. We go out and we make things happen, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to media questions regarding DSME, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism said, quote, "I don't see how the fact that we've invested in a company, I don't see where that gives them an advantage over other companies," end quote. The Minister went on to say, quote, "They've got every right as taxpayers, as a business, to compete," end quote. I will remind the government side that the Minister is responsible for an annual budget of $187 million of taxpayers' money and is supposed to be the brainpower behind economic development initiatives in this province. Given the magnitude of his portfolio, it is alarming to learn that he doesn't understand the basic fundamentals of competition. So my question on behalf of taxpayers, small businesses, the private sector, economists and business professors everywhere, how can the Minister justify his position on DSME that receiving $60 million and being 49% government-owned does not give DSME an advantage over local companies who pay for their salaries and expenses with their hard-earned business revenues?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, DSTN, and it's DSTN, like any other company in the province of Nova Scotia, have every right to have the same opportunities that other Nova Scotians have when it comes to bidding on contracts. Mr. Speaker, we have a fair, transparent procurement process here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's about fairness. We've created jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. You heard the Premier earlier today talk about engineering jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we create jobs from everything from the individual that's going to carry the briefcase to the person that's going to get an engineering degree, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe my comments today may surprise the members of the NDP government. I rise today in my place to commend the Minister of Economic and Rural Development on the success of his Jobs Here program. Under this minister's watch, Mr. Speaker, 13,019 Nova Scotians have found good paying jobs in Alberta. The reality is, while this minister likes to claim the Jobs Here program has been a success, the numbers say different. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is this. When does the minister plan to rename the Jobs Here program and instead call it the Jobs Alberta program? At least that way, when he calls the program a success, he'll be able to claim this with truth in his voice.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am surprised that a member of the third party, the previous government, that left this province in such a mess, a total mess. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, despite that mess that we inherited from that bunch over there, Mr. Speaker, we've created 7,600 jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
And you know, it is obvious to me, and I'm sure to other members of the House, that this government has been in power for 3 years. They can't fix the problems that they say that was created by others. It shows that they don't deserve to be in government. And Mr. Speaker, when you talk about 7,600 part-time jobs, that's not good enough for the people of the province of Nova Scotia. Southern Nova Scotia has lost 7,500 full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. On the South Shore, the workforce has decreased by 3,800 people. In Cape Breton, 300 full-time jobs have vanished under this NDP government. Yet despite this, the Premier told the members of this House's Assembly job growth is growing in the right direction, and I want to table that. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is entitled to his own office, and he's entitled to his own staff, but, Mr. Speaker, he's not entitled to his own facts. And the fact of the matter is that more than 13,000 Nova Scotians are working in Alberta proves that this Premier is wrong. Could the Minister of Economic and Rural Development offer some clarification on behalf of his boss? With over 13,000 Nova Scotians working in Alberta, when the Premier says job growth is going in the right direction, does he mean westward?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we came into to government, do you know what? There was a problem. There was a problem in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know on this side of the House, the people on the outside of the House know what the problem was, Mr. Speaker, and it's right over there, Mr. Speaker. It was that bunch over there, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Yeah, it is getting a little loud in here, so I'd remind it's getting a little bit heated in here, so I asked all the members to take a deep breath so we can continue the debate in this chamber in a nice parliamentary way. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, is that when we came into government, there was a trend. There was a trend of people of out-migration. Mr. Speaker, but we are changing that, Mr. Speaker. We are changing that. We are turning the corner. We've got things on the horizon, Mr. Speaker, that are game changers that no other government before us has ever realized. These are things that are going to, once in a lifetime, these things happen, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? One would say that luck has a little bit to do with it. And you know what? They may be right to a degree. But I would also say good, hard, honest work has a lot more to do with it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Speaker, and it surprises me that DSTN doesn't have any orders for their wind turbines when you consider the wind that's coming from that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, here's an interesting fact. 13,019 is the number of Nova Scotians that are working in Alberta. It also falls within the 25% variance for Nova Scotia's new electoral boundaries. Now, since the Minister of Economic and Rural Development will not take the right steps to ensure that those 13,000 men and women are able to find good-paying jobs in Nova Scotia, maybe he at least could do them the favour by letting them play a role in firing the NDP government here in Nova Scotia. Now, my question to the Minister is this. When will the Minister urge his would-be gerrymandering colleagues to establish the new constituency of Nova Scotia Gone West so that those... Oh, I have no problem slowing down. When will the Minister urge his would-be gerrymandering colleagues to establish the new constituency of Nova Scotia Gone West so that the more than 13,000 Nova Scotians working in Alberta will at least be able to properly voice their displeasure with this NDP government?
I would remind the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West that the impunitive motive during question period is unparliamentary. So I would ask the Honourable Member if he would retract that, please. Gerrymandering.
No problem. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
And I'd like to repeat my question now.
No, I get the honourable question to the Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we recognize on this side of the House that we are doing a lot of the right things. We are doing things under the PIP initiative, Mr. Speaker, where we are investing in companies, we are investing in peoples, we are becoming more innovative, we are becoming more productive, and we are becoming more competitive on a global basis. Mr. Speaker, if I may, and I'll try not to be too long, I want to read something from the Herald today, Mr. Speaker. And you know, I'm going to read from this. The region of Queens is seeing phenomenal growth, despite the closure of the community's main employer. Not one business has closed as a result of Bullwater's shutdown. Just the opposite has happened. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are some members that don't like to hear this, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you this is what Nova Scotians want to read.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Minister of Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, while this NDP government is giving away hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate handouts, something I might add they were vehemently against in opposition, the unemployment rate in Cape Breton is well over 16%. If it weren't for the Cape Bretoners who are working out west, the unemployment rate would be double that number, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 16% unemployment rate is 6.5% increase from last year and 20% higher than it was in 2009. Mr. Speaker, why is this minister, it's a strange thing, Mr. Speaker. Every time I mention the shortcomings of this government, I get the attention of the Premier. Are you finished, Mr. Premier?
Order, please. Order.
Mr. Speaker, why is the Minister of Economic and Rural Development like... I don't know what he's the one that should be out of here.
There's nobody getting out of here, but once I say order, all the mics are turned off, so... Okay, well, now I'm going to recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South to continue.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is why is the Minister for Economic and Rural Development Tourism handing out hundreds of millions to large corporations who lay off workers while he ignores economic development in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've made huge investments in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and I think one just has to remember what happened very recently with NewPage. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that the Liberal Party may not want to recognize the investments that we made in NewPage, Mr. Speaker, because they didn't want us to make that investment, Mr. Speaker. We invested in those families and those individuals in that community because, Mr. Speaker, it was the right thing to do.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's amazing with all the things that the minister says he's done in Cape Breton that the unemployment rate is still 16% and climbing. There must be something wrong with that logic, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in opposition, the NDP in opposition called large corporate donations that they were going to corporate welfare bums in Nova Scotia. That's the words that came from the present Minister of Health. That's the words that came from the former Minister of Finance and now the member for Fairview. They railed against corporate give-outs when they were in opposition, and now they're cozy in the pockets of big business in Nova Scotia. How times have changed. Mr. Speaker, since October of 2009, shortly after this government took office, the number of unemployed workers in Cape Breton has jumped by 21%. This minister has been ignoring economic diversification and instead signing over hundreds of millions of dollars to corporations who end up laying off Nova Scotians and cutting wages and benefits. Because of this failed approach, we have the worst GDP growth, the second lowest wage growth, and Nova Scotians are losing full-time work and being forced to take on part-time jobs to try to keep up with the rising costs of electricity, heating oil, gas, and food. The NDP minister's record in Cape Breton is a 20% spike in unemployment since taking office, and he's going to have to answer for that. Mr. Speaker, why has this minister ignored the need to diversify the economy in Cape Breton and get people back to work?
Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can remember since we've been in government, I remember small companies as well as large companies. I've already talked about NewPage. What about Build It, Mr. Speaker? What about Stream, Mr. Speaker? You know, there's TechLink now, Mr. Speaker, a company that we've invested heavily in to give them an opportunity to go out and make money. Mr. Speaker, we've made investments in Cape Breton. Unlike other governments, Mr. Speaker, of the past, we make good investments in Cape Breton. We believe in Cape Breton. We believe in the hard-working Cape Bretoners, and the recent investment in New Page is a testimony to that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South and his final supplementary.
Last I heard, Mr. Speaker, New Page is only half the employment that they used to have in that particular industry because of this government. But I want to remind, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind Cape Bretoners that this minister keeps talking about his role in Stream. I'll tell you how little this minister knows about his own department. Stream was in Glace Bay long before this government ever came to office in Nova Scotia. And it was brought to Nova Scotia, it was brought to Cape Breton by a payroll rebate system that the previous Liberal government of this province set up in Cape Breton, in Glace Bay. So, Mr. Speaker, time after time this minister talks about a success story in Stream. He had nothing to do with that, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians should know that, as well as he's had nothing to do with some of the other supposed success stories that he's toting in this House. Mr. Speaker, in the last 3 years, Cape Breton has seen employment drop and unemployment rise. Young people are finding it harder and harder to live and work in their communities. Many of those who do find work end up finding it out west, and we all know and have relatives that are employed out west because of the lack of opportunities in Cape Breton. Young people need jobs to be able to choose to stay in their communities, but instead the minister has given away another 10 today, $600 million to 7 corporations now, who 6 of them in turn have laid off more than 1,300 workers and slashed wages and benefits. Mr. Speaker, $600 million in corporate handouts, and Cape Breton has still seen unemployment jump by over 20% in the last 3 years. Mr. Speaker, I think I've struck a chord with the Premier. He seems very animated over there listening to my comments. So, Mr. Speaker, what more proof does the minister need for him to realize that his multi-million-dollar handouts to large corporations aren't working for the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member commented about Stream, and I just want to read you something from Hansard. It's from another member from Cape Breton, and it goes like this, Mr. Speaker. That's it? Well, Mr. Speaker, the Stream $2.1 million was a payroll rebate. Well, it says rebates here, but I think he meant rebate, through NSBI with job targets. So, and this is coming from a member from Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. So, I'm glad the minister took my advice on that file, Mr. Speaker, and I will table that. And I want to, you can't have it every way. And I'll just one other thing I want to add. One other thing I will add, Mr. Speaker, is I remember when that member over there was Minister of Economic and Rural Development, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you right now, the unemployment was less when we were in government than what it was under your watch.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The family of Raymond Tavel said this government failed to give adequate consideration to public safety in the report of commission in response to his death. And I quote, "It is unacceptable to reason that we should not pursue GPS tracking in Nova Scotia because it has yet to be adopted in any other forensic facility in Canada." Mr. Speaker, it does not matter whether or not people have been found criminally responsible. If they are dangerous, Nova Scotians deserve to be protected from them. Will the minister start using ankle bracelets with GPS tracking for people who are a danger to themselves and to others?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that question. First, I want to acknowledge the loss to the Tavel family and the impact that the passing had. Putting that to one side, I want to point out the difference between this government's approach to the issue of bracelets and the third party. The third party believes in building jails and filling them. They believe that people that have a mental illness should be treated like criminals. And this government believes, and this minister believes, and this government believes that if somebody has a mental illness, they should be treated by the healthcare professionals.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Progressive Conservative Party believes people with mental illness deserve treatment as well. But we also believe that that needs to be balanced with protection for those people and for the people who are on the street with them. Now, Raymond Tavel's family is trying hard to have some good come from his tragic death. They believe providing patients who have a history of violence with ankle bracelets should be common sense. This government, instead, wishes to provide patients with cell phones. This is not common sense, Mr. Speaker. The Tavel family argues, and I quote, "There must be an appropriate and nuanced balance between the joint goals of public protection and reasonable treatment and rights of offenders who have been found not criminally responsible for what could otherwise be criminal conduct." So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, this government does need balance. Will the minister take immediate steps to assure there will be electronic monitoring ankle bracelets available for people who, though not found criminally responsible for their crime, nevertheless are a danger to themselves and to the public?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, on the issue of bracelets, and to place a bracelet on someone, it's best left to the court to make a decision if someone has that issue. On the issue of somebody in a forensic institution, that public safety is an issue, and it is always an issue. And for this minister who has spent a lifetime serving the public from a safety perspective, I believe in that firmly. But to try and hold a tragedy to a family and to a community, the Tavel, and trying to make the political hay that you're trying to make on the issue of bracelets, that's just totally inappropriate and offensive.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this minister has a problem. He has a report that contained no representation from experts in protecting the public, a report with no balance. The balance is exactly what the Tavel family wants. They want the public and the patients protected by considering electronic monitoring. Yet this government will go forward with any idea that gives them peace of mind. Appointing a bureaucrat to give patients a call to see where they are will not make a difference for those who are at risk to public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question to the minister, if he won't provide more ankle bracelets immediately, will he stand here and tell the Tavel family that he will get a report that does give proper consideration to public safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you for that question. The recommendations that come out of the review are 18, and this government is taking steps, and this department is taking steps to accomplish all of those 18 recommendations. I want to assure the Tavel family, since the Conservatives are trying to use them and play them in a political sense, that we take their loss and the impact on their family seriously. I have trust and faith in the people that work in the forensic institution. I have trust and faith in our correctional officers that do their job, unlike the Conservative Party, who do not care or respect the staff that we have working that do a great job day in and day out.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, just 2 years ago, this government, the NDP, lowered mercury emission standards for Nova Scotia Power. Now, that was among the first signs that Nova Scotians had that they had elected Nova Scotia Power rather than the NDP to government. At the time, the NDP said the reason behind the decision to lower emission targets, despite every other province meeting their targets and having lower power bills, they said it would save money. And, Mr. Speaker, I will table the press release where the government said they would it would lower the bills. Mr. Speaker, does the minister still stand by the government statement that reducing mercury emission targets would help with power rates?
The Honourable Minister of Energy. The Honourable Minister of Environment, I'm sorry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. Again, we have a Nova Scotia approach and something that we feel that we're going to meet these goals and actually surpass them. So we have a made in Nova Scotia approach. Unlike the opposition, we do things right. Thank you very much for the question.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that's a funny response because 2 years ago, this minister was standing up and saying that by reducing the mercury standards and by putting the health of Nova Scotians at risk, that Nova Scotia power bills would be lower. Yet the Liberty audit looked at that, and it turns out that as a result of lowering the mercury emission standards, Nova Scotia Power spent $3.65 million more on fuel than they would have otherwise with the original targets, and I will table that. That has been passed on to ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, will the minister now admit that decreasing the mercury emission requirements actually cost ratepayers?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Again, I want to thank the member opposite for the question and something that we have laid out. Our goals will be achieved, and we'll achieve them by reducing mercury. But I also want to point out our history as 3 short years as an environment, and something that the member opposite need to appreciate. I think we have a track record that can really be appreciated. In environment, we have been recognized in the 3 years as A- with drinking water standards. We also received 2 awards in Copenhagen in 2009. We're world leaders when it comes to house waste management, Mr. Speaker, and we have signed an equivalency agreement with the federal government, saving over $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, we know about the environment, we protect it. Welcome to paradise. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apparently the minister has no way to answer this question. He did 2 years ago, and maybe he should spend some time down at the board hearing where it's one of the few things that even Nova Scotia Power isn't arguing with Liberty about the reason that this was caused. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, he can talk about the equivalency agreement, yet even the Premier couldn't put the numbers on and couldn't promise that can be met now because of the problems with Muskrat Falls and the delays on that, so we don't know what's going to happen there. Mr. Speaker, much of that equipment had already been installed, so we're still paying the amortization on the cost. Ratepayers are paying the amortization cost for the mercury equipment, and the Bag House in Trenton is an example where it was exceeding expectations on mercury capture. And Mr. Speaker, the fact is that $3.65 million extra was spent on fuel because they purchased lower quality fuel because they didn't feel they had to buy the better one. It burned less efficiently, and as a result, they had to burn more total coal, which cost ratepayers more. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister now apologize to Nova Scotians for this mistake, which cost ratepayers more than it needed to?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I welcome the question. Again, I want to point out that we have a made in Nova Scotia approach to address this issue. Unlike the opposition, they had many years to deal with this issue. And like the fossil fuel itself, they are fossil because they did not deal with the issue when they had the opportunity. Thank you for the question. We have a path forward. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, young Nova Scotians are facing higher debt, higher costs of their higher education, and fewer job prospects in the province of Nova Scotia. There is currently a tuition policy review underway, which could see tuitions increase as a direct result of the NDP deep cuts to universities. Students want to know where their Premier stands, Mr. Speaker, so will the Premier stand up for students and prevent further tuition increases in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to start by saying, and I know that the member for Yarmouth knows that not a single word of what he said was true, right? Mr. Speaker, in fact, This government brought in a debt cap that actually capped the amount of debt, and it was a great benefit to students by lowering the amount of debt that they have. That we have invested more in student aid than any government in this province, with the exception of the advent of the student aid program.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier might be in denial, but students and their families who are paying high tuition aren't. The question was about tuition. Mr. Speaker, yesterday students marched to protest the rising costs of a post-secondary education and the crushing debt load that they carry. A report released by Sun Life Financial concluded that economic uncertainty and financial strain is having a detrimental effect on mental health of young people. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This is a real problem which is only made worse by the dismal track record of this Premier when it comes to employment opportunities for young people. Young Nova Scotians faced with crushing debt loads and higher unemployment rates in this province are being forced to leave their communities to take jobs elsewhere, primarily out west. Mr. Speaker, why is this Premier giving Nova Scotia Power a free ride and doling out hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate handouts to companies who lay off Nova Scotians instead of investing in the future of our young people?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, so far, this government has invested some $90 million in student aid. Like I said, more than has been invested at any time in the future, reducing the amount of debt that students have in this province. In addition, we are investing in good jobs for young people, for new grads, and a perfect example happened today when a co-op student from engineering stood with me at the announcement of projects for 440 engineering jobs that will come to Nova Scotia that will attract exactly those kinds of students. And yet, the Liberals speak out against these kinds of investments, Mr. Speaker. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because they are job killers.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Please use that publicly. It's just ridiculous that the Premier would even say that. It doesn't even make any sense. Yeah. One of the parties in here are job killers. We all want to kill jobs. The fact is, Mr. Speaker.
Very difficult to hear in the chair if I'm listening for the debate to find out if the debate is parliamentary in any way. It's very difficult to hear when everybody's chattering all the time. And I can't hear some things that are being said sitting in this chair. Now, I would ask that everybody realize that the honourable member from Yarmouth has the floor. So I'd ask for a little bit of quiet from here on in, please. The honourable member for Yarmouth on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier stands and boasts often about all the great opportunities he's creating for young Nova Scotians in this province. But under his leadership, Mr. Speaker, over 4,800 young people have left this province to look for work elsewhere. That's the record of this Premier, Mr. Speaker. Since the Premier took office, young people have lost full-time jobs at a rate of 18.3%. Over that same period, unemployment has spiked by over 50% for young women. It is these same young people who are saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in debt when they finish school. Quite clearly, corporations are now more important to this NDP Premier than the students he once courted while in opposition. So my question, and I'll table that data as well, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Speaker is, to the Premier is, Mr. Speaker, will he finally stand up for students and commit to this House today that he will not allow any more tuition increases in the province of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as they would know, under our government, the average tuition fees in this province are actually falling below the national average. Mr. Speaker, when we came into government, the first thing that happened was that the money that was set aside by the federal government for the purposes of reducing tuition came to an end. The trust fund that was in place came to an end. So the first thing that we had to do, if we did nothing, the tuitions in the province would have went up 15 to 20% because that money was no longer available. So the first thing that we did, Mr. Speaker, is we backfilled $30 million in order to ensure that tuitions did not rise 15 to 30%. And here's the ironic thing. In order to do that, Mr. Speaker, we had to bring in a budget which the Liberals voted against.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are finding it harder to pay their bills, their power bills, and they feel let down by a premier who continues to stand up for Nova Scotia Power's shareholders instead of standing up for our province's most vulnerable citizens. The premier could have stood up against a power rate increase, but he didn't. The premier could legislate that shareholders pay for efficiency programs, but he won't. And the premier could take action to make power bills lower for low-income Nova Scotians, but he refuses. People are wondering what happened to the NDP principles. Will the premier stand up for low Nova Scotians today? Will the premier stand up today for low-income Nova Scotians and make Nova Scotia Power pay for its efficiency programs instead of making it yet another NDP burden on Nova Scotians living in poverty?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the very first things that this government did was put in place the removal of the HST from energy. Mr. Speaker, we took the HST off of children's clothing. Mr. Speaker, we put in place the affordability tax credit to actually put more money in the pockets of those people who are most affected by economic uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, no one has done more to ensure that those who are the most vulnerable in this province are properly taken care of than this government.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but that's certainly not what we heard at the Community Services Committee the other day from the face of poverty. In fact, I believe the word was negligible. Insignificant. This premier is handing out big checks to corporations and promising them breaks on power rates. How is it that the premier had no issues giving Stern a break on their power but does nothing to give low-income Nova Scotians a break on their power bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we took the tax off of home energy, something the Liberals voted against. Mr. Speaker, this year we will spend $70 million on the affordability tax credit. We will spend another $25 million on the children's tax credit. Mr. Speaker, all of this money goes right into the pockets of low-income families. The last time the Liberals were in power, they clawed back that money from poor families, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, they are proposing to put in place a scheme of deregulation that will increase power rates for those same people by 30 to 50%.
The honourable member for... The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal caucus, as the Premier well knows, has stated repeatedly that we will not put the provincial portion of the HST back on power bills, and we will demand that it's the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power who will pay for efficiency programs instead of Nova Scotian families.
Order. I can't hear the debate. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Philip Barkhouse of Chester Basin contacted Efficiency Nova Scotia to participate in its low-income homeowner service. Instead of service, Mr. Barkhouse got a letter saying he's on the wait list due to the program's limited budget, and I will table that letter. In fact, Mr. Barkhouse was told he should expect a call from Clean Nova Scotia in 2013. So this NDP government continues to impose what is, in essence, a flat tax on Nova Scotians, including our poorest citizens. These are the very families who cannot even access these programs that they're forced to pay for. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this: why did this Premier and his NDP government continue to make low-income Nova Scotians pay for efficiency programs they can't even access?
Honourable the Premier.
Now, let me see, 2013, so that's in 6 weeks. Mr. Speaker, I mean, really, and they're laughing about that. I mean, Mr. Speaker, the demand-side management charge was put in place after the board had hearings and heard from a whole collection of group across the province who said what they wanted.
The Honourable Premier has the floor, please.
Mr. Speaker, the consumer groups, ecology groups right across the province said what they wanted was an independent efficiency organization that would be free of government, Mr. Speaker, paid for so that they could deliver services that would benefit the entire population of Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, $42 million is what they collected. Ratepayers, as a result of this, saved $100 million. Mr. Speaker, $100 million. In fact, the savings are actually greater from the poorer Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, because it makes up a bigger part of their bill, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what they have said, and this is what the Liberal Party have said, they keep trying to weasel around it, but the reality is that okay? That's dodgy. Okay, I'll withdraw.
No, that is
I'll withdraw weasel, Mr. Speaker. What they try to do is maneuver around what they've said. The Leader of the Opposition voted against the HST coming off of home electricity. Then he voted in favor of the Conservatives putting it back on it. He campaigned against it twice in the leadership debate, Mr. Speaker, and he would remember, I certainly do, he said taking the HST off was bad public policy, Mr. Speaker. Did he believe it or doesn't he?
I would remind honourable members.
Take it outside. You'll get to the front bench someday, Clary. Maybe not someday.
I'd like to remind the Honourable Premier that the word weasel was unparliamentary and retracting that. Thank you. And I'd also like to now recognize the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to the most recent hunger count report, food bank usage is up 39.3% in Nova Scotia since 2008, and I'm tabling that. As well, food banks are seeing a marked increase in users who are employed. This should be no surprise, as our province is witnessing a displacement from full-time work to part-time jobs. At the same time, the Premier has handed out over $500 million, I guess $600 million now, to corporations that have laid off workers, cut wages, and slashed benefits. Meanwhile, more Nova Scotians have had to rely on part-time jobs and food banks. So my question, why are large corporations more important to the Premier than poor people?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and I think it's sad that these kinds of questions get asked, really. Mr. Speaker, the reality is they vote against and they criticize the actual efforts that keep people working, Mr. Speaker. The investments in Port Hawkesbury mean that there are 1,000 people working. If they had their way, Mr. Speaker, they would have not supported Port Hawkesbury, and 1,000 or 1,400 people would be out of jobs, Mr. Speaker. That's because what they are doing is engaging either disingenuously in just political posturing. But you know something? I don't think so. I think the truth is the Liberals are simply job killers.
The honourable member. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, low income is the key factor in determining the need for food banks. Families are facing rent increases related to food. They're facing rising costs related to food, housing, and energy. There are currently over 1,800 families waiting for public housing in this province. Mr. Speaker, this doesn't even include the number of homeless people, nor does it reflect the number of poor families and seniors living in inadequate shelters or who have to choose between heating their homes or feeding their families. Nova Scotia needs a plan for affordable housing and not just Band-Aid programs and more talk. My question to the Premier, when will this government act to eliminate poverty and make a real investment in affordable housing?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For years, we watched while the Liberals continued to claw back income from the poorest Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That is just a reality. This is the same group of people who vote against increases in the minimum wage. They vote against taking the HST off of children's clothing. They vote against taking the HST off of children's shoes. They vote against taking the HST off of necessities like home electricity, Mr. Speaker. They want to see what is wrong with the program in Nova Scotia. They only have to look back to when they were in government, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we are still suffering from Liberal governments both in this province and federally.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it interesting that the Premier should mention a clawback. I recently had a case where a woman couldn't access the emergency home repair program because her child tax credit pushed her over the limit. So there's enough blame to go around there. Mr. Speaker, food banks are seeing an increase in numbers. Soup kitchens are seeing an increase in need, and more children are relying on school breakfast programs. More and more people are in need, and they're looking to their government to help. While this government announced the special medical needs would no longer be covered for our poorest citizens, this Premier was negotiating $500 million deals with corporations. While this government was negotiating deals on power rates for big corporations, families were having their power cut off because they can't pay their bills. How does the Premier have an endless supply of cash to dole out to corporations while more and more Nova Scotians are faced with the question, heat or eat?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that we are investing in good jobs in the province, so the very people that she's talking about actually have the best form of support, which is a decent job. Mr. Speaker. But I would just remind the member from Bedford Birch Cove that she should think back to the mid-90s when the federal Liberals were gutting things like the child benefits. They were ending universality for allowances, Mr. Speaker, and canceling the grants to universities, Mr. Speaker. You know, she might remember, she might actually know somebody who was part of that government.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. The NDP mismanagement of the economy has taken the worst toll on the people of the Southern Shore. South Shore has lost 7,500 full-time jobs. That means 7,500 people who are worried about their future in rural Nova Scotia. So last week, the minister said, and I quote, "This government has protected jobs in the province of Nova Scotia." So why didn't the people and jobs of the South Shore benefit from this minister's protection?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's on Monday. Next week, I think there's a grand opening at White Point. I think it's Monday. Somebody might want to, Mr. Speaker. So that's an investment by this government in the South Shore, Mr. Speaker. So we during the South Shore, Mr. Speaker, we've been working collaboratively with the people of the South Shore region, and White Point is only one example. Earlier today, Mr. Speaker, I tabled a report that was in the Herald today, Mr. Speaker, talking about the South Shore and talking about all the good things and the positive attitude that was going on in the South Shore, and certainly highlighted by the collaboration with this government.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
The people of the South Shore suffered another blow yesterday when Twin Cities Air Service announced that it would be ending the Yarmouth to Portland flights. This announcement means yet another transportation link from Yarmouth area has been severed and likely will lead to more job losses, Mr. Speaker. The unemployment rate has risen to 13.1%. This rate of unemployment is closer to the near bankrupt countries of Greece and Spain than it is to the Canadian average. So my question to the minister, will the minister finally admit that the NDP management of the economy has failed people of southern Nova Scotia and is making life harder for the entire region?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know many people, myself included, would like to see a successful air service in Southwest in Yarmouth. I think if there was a successful air service in Yarmouth, that would be a clear indication of things have turned around. Mr. Speaker, unlike previous governments, under the Jobs Here strategy, Mr. Speaker, we are planning for the future. What we don't want to do, and like past governments, is we don't want to do things on a daily basis. We want to make sure that we make sound investments to promote not only Southwest Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, but the entire province. And again, I reiterate is that things are going reasonably well in Southwest Nova Scotia, and I tabled the Herald report, and I would encourage the honourable member to look at that Herald report.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Is that the standard has changed, that doing reasonably well now means an unemployment rate of 13.1%. Mr. Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. South Shore workforce decreased by 3,800 people. That means 3,800 people have given up on finding a job. Population in the area has decreased by 2,700 people. That means 2,700 people have given up on the area and moved somewhere else. So my question to the minister, in an NDP Nova Scotia, the government picks winners and losers. So why does this minister continue to punish the people of Southwest Nova Scotia and offer them no relief?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I know that one thing, Mr. Speaker, is that there are many people that live in the Southwest region.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the article that I tabled today, one of the things that's said in the article by a very well-known individual in the Southwest region that has been very, very involved is what was said is that we are better off today than what we were 3 years ago, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Annapolis Collaborative Health Centre will officially open on Friday. I must note for the record that it has already experienced its first closure, Mr. Speaker, daytime closure due to the lack of nurses. Overnight, the facility will be staffed by 1 RN and primary care paramedic, which essentially means primary health care 24/7, not necessarily emergency care, is being offered through what used to be an emergency department, Mr. Speaker. When a patient arrives and requires emergency care beyond the capacity of the collaborative team, emergency care needs to be provided. So my question to the Minister, could the Minister of Health please tell the residents of Annapolis what he is doing to ensure there's adequate emergency care should a patient arrive at the Annapolis Collaborative Health Centre requiring it?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Leader for that question. No question, we're very glad to see another collaborative emergency centre open in Nova Scotia to provide care for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure the member from Annapolis and the members or the residents who live in that area that will be served by the Collaborative Emergency Centre that emergency care will be delivered to those residents. The last time I checked, Mr. Speaker, paramedics provide emergency care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Annapolis Community Health Centre could take level 1 and 2 patients, emergency patients, Mr. Speaker. The new Collaborative Emergency Centre cannot. We have heard from the health professionals in the area, Mr. Speaker, that no ambulance coverage in the Bridgetown area about 40% of the time, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, they can only provide care if they're there, Mr. Speaker. The ability of the patients to access emergency care 24/7 is non-existent for the residents being served by the new collaborative emergency team, which ironically, Mr. Speaker, was developed to keep emergency rooms open 24/7. So my question to the Minister, how can the emergency care be relied upon at the Annapolis Collaborative Centre when 40% of the time Bridgetown has no ambulance coverage, which results in a domino effect in all emergency vehicles in the area?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No question, we have one of the most state-of-the-art ambulance service, ground and air ambulance service in North America, Mr. Speaker. And it's well recognized that we have a system that can react to calls throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. We have a system status plan that oversees the ambulance services in Nova Scotia. So when there is a number of calls in certain regions, those ambulances in other regions start moving around the province, Mr. Speaker. It's a great system that ensures that the closest ambulance responds to the emergency closest to them, Mr. Speaker. It's a long way from where we were a number of years ago. Collaborative emergency centres, Mr. Speaker, are the key to ensuring that not only nurses, but paramedics and physicians work to their full scope of practice, Mr. Speaker. And I have full confidence that collaborative emergency centres will meet the needs of Nova Scotians and the emergency needs of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for congratulating the former Liberal government on its foresight to be able to create the emergency services that we have in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, what's happening, Mr. Speaker, under the present situation, closing to community health collaborative care centres, Mr. Speaker, without those facility emergency rooms being open, we rely on the ambulance service and the ambulance bases being, Mr. Speaker, having ambulances there. And the Minister knows it's a domino effect, that when something happens, the rigs move continually up the valley. All the citizens of the Annapolis area are asking, has the Minister taken this into account when he's now closing the emergency room and telling them to call 911? Where's the ambulance going to be? Has he taken that into account to make sure that we have the proper care when we need it?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would agree. The only good decision from the former Liberal government was from Dr. Ron Stewart, Mr. Speaker, and it dealt with paramedics in this province. I can tell you on a number of occasions, and being a healthcare provider in the 90s, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a good time for healthcare providers under a former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. We're going to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we have a system in place that meets the needs of Nova Scotians. And collaborative emergency centres will do that, Mr. Speaker. Those nurses, those paramedics that are working in the collaborative emergency centres are in contact with medical control oversight, Mr. Speaker, so they have access to a medical doctor, so that they can work as a team, Mr. Speaker. The problem in the past is that we continue to do things the same old way, Mr. Speaker, and they weren't meeting the needs of Nova Scotians. That's why we have to change the model of care, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're ensuring that nurses, paramedics, physicians, Mr. Speaker, work to their full scope of practice, and that they work in a collaborative approach to address the issues, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the residents in the communities that are served by collaborative emergency centres currently, Mr. Speaker, they appreciate it and they welcome that, Mr. Speaker. Even the leader of the Liberal.
Please. The time allotted for questions. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism should get an Academy Award for fiction in this place. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education and Tourism, during question period, stated that his government put the call centre stream operation in Glace Bay, which is at best a misleading statement. The facts are, in this case, Mr. Speaker, that stream has been in Glace Bay for close to 15 years, brought there with a payroll rebate system set up by the Liberal government in the late 90s. So I would ask the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism whether he should set this House straight and apologize to the House for misleading